What we believe is true, and this is our own experience from porting our own distributed workspaces, they're not very complicated, but if you're basically just using APL stuff in workspaces, stuff in component files, stuff where you're using the APL format in TCP sockets to pass data around, your code will just load and run, pretty much. There are potential problems if you're using monadic grade up, which is this is in fact the only real difference in the language, is that monadic grade up returns different results from what it did before. If you're using quad DR to test whether something is character, and especially as Gary mentioned, if you're, for example, using dyadic quad DR to cast characters, you have 4 characters which you think are the representation of an integer, and you use dyadic quad DR to turn them into an integer, then you may not get what you expected at all, because those characters may now be, double byte characters, and you'll get 2 integers instead of 1. And finally, not actually language difference, but the arrays may get bigger. Okay, so
I would think you would also have to inspect, I think, every reference of quad AV in your program. For example, if you're using membership quad AV as a test for character data, you could get in trouble there too, right?
Yes, it depends on whether your application is going to encounter new data or not. The question there is, why are you upgrading to Unicode? Is it simply because you want to be on the new platform, try and reduce some of the operational issues? Or is it because you actually want to write an application to sell it in Russia? In the first case, you might actually need to take steps to prevent characters not in quad AV from entering into the system. And we haven't actually we haven't put an option into the GUI, for example, where you could say, don't accept Unicode characters. Maybe we should consider that. We were sort of thinking, well, those people should stay in classic version until they're ready. But certainly this is a problem. So it may be a problem. Many cases when you're using monadic grade up, you don't actually care about the order. It's sort of part of an idiom or something, and the exact order, you're using it to generate uniqueness or something, and the actual order that is produced is not important. But sometimes it is. Anyway, the solution to this is straightforward. Give it the left argument of quad AV, and it will do what it used to do.
So is there a little performance up doing that?
Yes, yeah. Dyadic upgrade with the left argument is clearly going to run more slowly than before. And again, we decided, we didn't want to penalize everybody in the future by having upgrade on characters, implicitly translate everything to the old whatever. Yeah.
Monadic grade up.
Yeah.
Sort of a fuzzy thing anyhow.
It is. On characters, it's a pretty
Well, it's
weird.
a fuzzy thing. So the question is, why not implement it as something that would reproduce the result that you have on the left? In other words, grade up based upon quad AV, and after quad AV, the rest of them.
Because then we would have to perpetuate the definition of quad AV. Essentially, we want to, when we teach new APL users in the future, we don't want to mention quad AV. It's being censored out of history.
All right. This is a monadic kind of crap anyhow.
Yeah, I would very much doubt that commercial applications use monadic upgrade on characters. It's
just a quick and dirty thing to do if you want.
You were asking, you were already in trouble if you were, essentially.
Another quick question, maybe you already said this.
Yeah.
How do I go between Classic and Unicode?
They're two different interpreters.
Completely different worlds.
Well, they are identical except for how they can handle characters. Okay, so testing for character data, you cannot use 82 imports. There'll be much more about that in a moment. Okay, so we recommend an expression like that because the same expression then will work both in Classic and Unicode. In fact, most most of the design of 12.0 has been about how do we make it possible for people to write code that will work the same way in Classic and Unicode, so that when they do a controlled migration, it'll be easier. Okay, so if you're doing something like this, well, in Classic, the 83 quad DR of upgrade gives you minus 109, and I'm not actually able to explain how that exactly works, because when Dyalog implemented quad DR, they did it to help people to migrate from APL Plus. They maintained the, essentially it uses the internal representations that APL Plus has to return the minus 109 here. It's got nothing to do with where upgrade is in Dyalog's quad AV. So it's for people who were reading native files, had quad N this, quad N that.
Was this the version of APL Plus, was that on the mainframe APL Plus? Might well have been rather than the PC.
I do not recall. I don't want to know.
So that may be the reason for the difference.
Yeah. So the internal representation is different. And of course in Unicode there's no translation going on. So that's just different. So anywhere you use quad DR, clearly you need to have a look at that and say, well, why am I doing quad DR here? How does this need to change? It might not need to change, because maybe what you should be doing is reading the characters from the file in a different way, and so that's not something I can answer.
64-bit integers in quad DR, I think.
Yeah.
That's my use.
Now we've gone as far as we thought was reasonable. So again, in the Unicode edition, if you can use 82 as a left argument to quad DR. And if you give it minus 109, it'll still give you the upgrade symbol. But of course, it's a type 160 array now. So if you were reading it from a file and the view was that the file contains an APL code that you want to fix or execute, this works. But if you were reading it in order to then subsequently cast it into a floating point number, then you won't get what you expected. So you simply need to, any use of quad DR needs to be manually inspected. And in all the applications I've ever worked on, quad DRs were fairly limited in a bunch of cover functions. If you've got quad DR on every line of your code, you're in trouble. But then you were in trouble already. Yeah. Quad UCS, as we mentioned, exists in Classic, but it must return something which is in quad AV, otherwise it'll give you a translation error. Okay? And then there is this consideration. Character data will require 2 bytes per element if it contains, essentially if it contains APL symbols. If it can, any element of quad AV which is not part of the ANSI set will require 2 bytes. But no existing APL array can need 4 bytes when you get into Unicode edition. Yes?
Because quad AV is 2 bytes, is 2-byte elements now, essentially.
Quad AV returns an
It's
array.
not just APL characters, but basically any non-ASCII characters that are present in quad AV
Any
would cause,
non-ANSI.
would cause blow up to
Would
2
blow up.
characters, 2 bytes.
And that includes comments in functions, character constants in code, and the script form of namespaces and classes. And the latter, of course, are very likely to blow up because they contain APL characters. They are.
But you already mentioned, but I think internally, do you store everything as 2-byte characters?
No, 1, 2, or 4.
Okay, so you do compress them.
Yeah. Exactly the same way as we deal with integers. Yeah.
So Kim, is there any way to predict when compression will happen? But where and when?
You mean the exact time at which APL there is, but I wouldn't want to commit to it because that's one of the kind of things that we look at changing. Yeah, it's not something you want to rely on. You can sort of peg it down using, or if you do the quad DR of something, it gets pegged internally and sticks with that representation. Yeah. Okay, so,
Morten,
yep.
what about the APL code? Is that the same as the ASCII code? Or?
That depends. Whether you are in
What do you
Denmark
usually
or
write
the
APL program?
Denmark or the UK, because when we became the dialogue dealer for Denmark, and Kim Andreasen was working for us at that time, he and I looked at that and we said, we do not want two quotes in quad AV in Denmark. We know the English have it and they weep from time to time. And we took out essentially the non-APL quote. But I don't know whether you have your own translate tables. I suspect you may have your own translate tables and not be using the official. So there are, you know, yeah. Well, I suppose I should. That's an 80 in my API. But I suppose we can, if you can type an accent, yeah.
Yeah, but the important thing is that
Look at that. Yeah, what about that?
I'm regretting that already.
That, was it?
Okay, well that's the Danish translate table is simply saying that character on its own doesn't exist in the Danish quad AV. Like quad AV, see, there is not one quad AV, and I'll get back to that in a moment. There are actually 4 or 5 or 6 different, and probably more quad AVs in the world. I suspect you actually have your own quad AV, which is different from that. And I know other customers have their own quad AVs. They use different fonts and they've redefined the characters. And if I don't run out of time by talking too much, I'll tell you something about
We're one of those.
how to deal with that. Okay, I better move on a little bit here, or 3 hours will certainly turn out to be much too little. Okay, so there's also if you want to use both Classic and Unicode, you have to be aware that although the workspaces and quad ORs can be moved across the line, the internal formats of functions have to be converted as they go from Classic to Unicode. Okay. So it's not recommended in a production application to run off, say, the same function file with quad ORs in it, because there will be a conversion as they come into either one or the other interpreter. Yeah. And because the internal representation has changed and there are various internal limits on how many, various bits of the internal representation of a function. If you have functions with thousands of lines or thousands of local names and so on there, or maybe just hundreds, you may find that there are a few functions which will fix in version 11, which you can't fix in the Unicode edition. But we probably do so. I mean, nobody's had a serious problem with that yet. Yeah. So, which one do you want to use? If you want to develop a completely new application, obviously you use the Unicode edition. People who apply for educational non-commercial licenses can only have the Unicode edition. Pocket APL will only be available in Unicode, and possibly Linux version. We're going to see if we can get away with not providing Classic Linux in the future, because that market isn't sort of really commercial yet. I think we may be able to get away with that. And use the Classic edition if you need other improvements that we've thrown into the product, but you're not ready to convert to Unicode yet. And Classic is supposed to be, as we usually do, completely compatible with version 11. The 2 editions are maintained from a single copy of source code. So it's not as if we have to make a change in Unicode and then we have to go and make it in Classic as well. So the cost to us of maintaining the two versions is not very high. We can tolerate continuing with this for a decade if we must. But we really do recommend that everybody starts thinking about moving to Unicode, and that you have a plan, 3-year plan, 5-year plan, 10-year plan if you must. So long as a single important customer is using Classic, it'll be there. It may get gradually more expensive.
Just keep adding zeros. Tack a zero on the price tag each year.
But we do not leave people in the lurch. So. Okay.
The ability to be able to tell which version you're running in, I think, becomes even more important if you're considering migrating. If it's easy to tell which version you're in.
Quality are. If it says 80, it's Unicode.
Try blip do without a space.
Ooh.
I hope that's 80. I think it was 160 at one point. Okay, so if you're just using these API components, they should just go and run. If you were unwise enough to use, external tools, something not API, then you're going to have to think about it, because you have to move data to that thing. It needs to support Unicode as well, and you need to agree on whether it's going to use UTF8 or 16 or whatever, and get that stuff matched up. So that's generally where the work is going to be in moving to Unicode. Is if you're using Oracle, you need to convert your Oracle database, perhaps. Maybe it's already using Unicode, maybe not. And there are different ways to store Unicode data in Oracle, and so on. Okay, so let's see. These versions are designed to interoperate seamlessly, and also, as far as we could, we want you to operate in a mixed environment. Again, this is our standard procedure for us. Backwards compatibility, we know, is very important to customers to avoid these big bang conversion events. So, Classic can read and translate data written by the Unicode version in files, workspaces, or on sockets. You can mark a component file or a TCP socket as being of style Classic, in which case the Unicode edition will actually convert data back to type 82 as it writes it, so that the version, even 10.1, will still be able to use the component file. But of course, that then writing to the component will fail if you have data which cannot be mapped to Quad AV. When the Unicode edition tries to read a component, if it contains data not in Quad AV, it will also get translation error. So the intention here is, you should be able to be careful, mark all your 32-bit files, by the way. 32-bit component files cannot have the Unicode flag set. So if you're still using 32-bit component files, then you can safely just start using version 12, and no Unicode, no unreadable data will end up in those component files. If you're using the 64-bit files, which have been available since version 10.1, you have the option of writing Unicode data to them. And there's a new function in version 12 called quadf copy that can copy the 32-bit file and turn it into a 64-bit file, preserving all the file timestamps and so on, so it doesn't become a different file.
So do you have to do anything to condition that 64-bit file for Unicode?
No, by default, 64-bit files are Unicode.
Are Unicode.
And from version 12, the default is to create 64-bit files. Because we support two back versions, and now version 10.1 knows about 64-bit files. So we've been holding off until all of the supported versions support 64-bit files before making it the default.
And that was from the beginning, absolutely. Unicode was supported in 64-bit from the beginning.
Yes, yeah.
And the 64-bit version of files using what UTC to convert as writes and reads.
No, they're not. Data is always written in the internal format, unless the file is, well, actually, if it's a Unicode file and the Classic version writes it, it will convert to Unicode as it writes it. And if it's a non-Unicode file, then the Unicode version will convert it to non-Unicode as it writes it. And error if it can't. So if you put a Chinese character in, it'll, quad FAPN will fail with translation error.
And it uses UCS to do that.
Well, internally, it doesn't just doesn't need to call the function. I mean, the internal representation. I'm not sure what exactly the question is. The internal representation for Unicode is Unicode data, so it doesn't need to translate it, just put it in the file.
Now,
you're thinking about what AVU, which we haven't got to yet. We'll get to that in a moment.
Now, what I mean is that currently in version 11, the Cyrillic part is located somewhere at the end of quad AV. And when I write to Unicode file, essentially I would like that Cyrillic letters codes to be replaced with the Unicode ones.
They are, yeah.
They are. So
yes. Yeah. Well, I'll show that, I hope. Yeah. Okay, I've said that before. And what we're hoping is that by us having done all this work to make it easy for you to run Unicode and Classic at the same time, you will all be nice and do what you can to move your applications. Because, 10 years from now, if you're still not using Unicode, it's going to be painful for us and it'll slow us down. We'll have to do more work adding new features to the product because we'll still have to be, making sure that Okay, so this is what we're hoping that, so far I think the people who have moved have found this to be the case. It hasn't been too hard to move. But of course there are people who have very complex interfaces to other systems. There are people who won't be able to move because they're using some version of a relational database that can't deal with Unicode. Or whatever. They've got a C library written 20 years ago and they've lost the source code and
Right. So you were talking about APs.
Or whatever.
You were talking about APs.
Yes.
Are you providing in your distribution now, in the AP framework that you provide, is that enabled?
Yes, I believe that's all upgraded. Okay, so we should move on. I think so far I'm spending too much time talking about things that are actually all explained in files that are about to come. So Classic and Unicode can load each other's workspaces, but of course Classic can't load a workspace containing characters not in its quad AV. Now, I think this is where we get to answering Alexei's question. The contents of quad AV are now defined by something called quad AVU, which is an integer vector containing 256 code points. So it defines what your quad AV is in terms of Unicode. And that's because, as I said before, there is more than one quad AV out there. There's the standard, well, what most people use in Western Europe now is something called Dyalog Alt, which is the name of a font, right? In the old days, it was the font that you used that essentially defined the meaning of quad AV. An element of quad AV had no inherent meaning. It was just whatever the font displayed. So in Western Europe, most people are using something called Dyalog Alt, which in this range here, 97, where the underscores used to be in the old days, displays a bunch of Icelandic and other things. Now you can say, well, I use underscores, and then you can set quad AVU to contain the circled alphabet Unicode code points, and if you then extract that part of quad AV, you get the underscores. Yeah. So when you then copy from a pre-version 12 workspace, or you read a component, a non-Unicode component Quad AVU, your Quad AVU decides how incoming character data is translated. So you can say, I'm reading type 82 data, and I know it was written by somebody using the Dyalog STD font. By setting Quad AVU to the correct setting, you can make sure that when you then read that stuff, you get underscores. And if you're Russian, if you've been using your own Russian font, by setting Quad AVU, you read Russian. And when you write, things get mapped back correctly as well. And I think Alexa, you have tried this, and it's sort of, it works pretty well. You can also now copy code that was written by people using underscores and people not using underscores. If you just set Quad AVU correctly at the point where you copy it, then some of the code will have underscores and the other code won't. But since it's now all uniquely defined in terms of Unicode code points, you no longer have a problem except typing it.
How come that came out? Back up one. How come the underbars came out as underbars rather than the circle D2 characters?
That's because Adrian's font misdisplays them.
Oh, okay.
Displays them incorrectly.
Right. Okay, good.
Yeah. If that was Arial Unicode MS, they would all be circled.
Gotcha. Thanks.
Yeah. So Dyalog STD, in fact, is used primarily by English and American applications that have been around for some time. Dyalog Alt is used across Western Europe. In Russia, I know Alexei has defined his own font, and if we provide a workspace, public workspace called AVU, which contains, for example, Russian.quadavu. If you copy that and look at Quad AV, it looks like this. You see what a Russian would have seen in version 11 by using his own special Russian font. But now with the Unicode version, we can all see that. If we just, when we copy a workspace or read a component, if we know it came from Russia and set Quad AVU at the point of reading it, we get what a Russian would expect. And the same, same is used for component files and TCP sockets. And it has namespace scope, so you could have a namespace for reading Russian components and a namespace for reading alt components in the same workspace, and just call the function in the right one. Okay, here we go. Jim, are you watching this? Yeah, there is no underscored alphabet in Unicode because despite all those meetings, they decided that underscoring is in form of emphasis, like bold or italic, and did not warrant its own. I guess we could, if we really wanted to, and an APL standards body was sort of reformed, we could probably go back to the Unicode consortium and say we must have underscores. We've got hundreds of books in which underscores are displayed, and that would be an argument that you could use to get them in if we wanted to. But I don't think
anyone cares.
Think we want to.
Except him.
Okay.
You're the only person on the planet that wants underscore.
An emphasis in the same way.
I mean, it's very odd. You saw the circled alphabetics. You saw the numbers from 1 to 20 with a dot, full stop after them. And the logic of what went in, just depended on how many people could argue that this was something they were using.
Subscripts and superscripts, are they an emphasis in the same way?
Subscripts and superscripts of which language?
Yeah.
Right, if you had the underscored Latin alphabet, but we also want underscored Arabic, does it make any sense? So I don't think we want to fight that back. Okay, I think we've talked about this. So in the Unicode edition, Quad AV is really only a map for interoperating with old versions of APL. It has no special significance. It's just another variable, or in fact, I think a function, because it simply takes Quad AVU and returns those characters. And there's another odd variable. There's a system variable that used to be called Quad A underscore, which returned the underscored alphabet. If you're using Dyalog Alt, the Dyalog Alt font, its name displays as Quad A acute. And you really want to stop using it. It's still there and it will return that part of quad AV, but
I was always annoyed there wasn't a quad A lowercase.
Yeah.
Because
well, you're not
we understand why. But,
I mean, the whole idea of, in fact, uppercase and lowercase is
Yeah.
a very strange thing. Right? There's only a very small number of the world's languages that have it. Most human languages do not have uppercase.
it's a font issue rather than a character issue.
It is really, yeah. I mean, the monks used to draw, pictures of the first capital. Yeah.
Maybe you should change them to quad U and quad L for uppercase and lowercase instead of using the same, instead of A.
Next slide, please.
Yes.
Yeah, there will be no more
Okay.
variables.
Very good.
Certainly not to deal with this. Okay, so we have not extended this list, and we discussed that. What has changed is that you can now both have, in the same workspace, you can have variables, or you can have names with underscores and these letters in the same workspace. Right, before, if you had the STD font, you could have the underscores. If you picked the alt font, you got the other ones. They were actually the same thing. Now they're actually separate. Yeah. And in standard font, the underscores, yeah, we've seen that before. And I've said that. But Russian letters, Alexei, unfortunately. If you've used Russian letters to define your variables or your function names,
Well, some of them work, some of them not.
then they
Depends
will
on
either
position.
become.
Or
You may
really
have a
good.
problem there. I'm not sure exactly. Okay, component files, same restrictions. I don't think we need to repeat that. You can mark a file as non-Unicode, and all the small span component files are only non-Unicode. This is sort of our way of pushing people a little bit towards Unicode. But I think actually it'll be very practical for people that they don't have to worry about getting their old component files polluted with Unicode data. It'll require a conscious decision to move to 64-bit component files.
What happens if you try to write type 80 into one of those files?
If the characters are in quad AV, they get translated. Otherwise, you get a translation error. It would not be hard for us perhaps to remove that restriction. In fact, we've had bugs where it was allowed. But I think we'd like to stick with this model a bit. Okay, so that means as long as you're not writing quarter bars of things in internal format to files, the Unicode edition can also share data with version 10.1 or earlier versions if the data is all compatible. So there's a new system function quad F props, which at the moment there are 4 properties. There's endian, which you can't change, which just tells you whether the file was created by a little endian or a big endian system. There's whether the file is journaled or not, which there's a presentation on file journaling tomorrow. The size, that's whether it's a 32-bit file or a 64-bit file. Essentially, can it be bigger than 4 gigabytes? And then there's the Unicode bit. And for those of you who don't know it, the second element of the argument to quad F create allows you to explicitly pick whether you want to create a 32-bit or 64-bit file.
Specifically, create, please repeat.
Whether you want to create a 32-bit architecture file or a 64-bit architecture file. It's not something you should normally want to care about.
Are you changing the default value of that?
Sorry,
If you omit?
yes, in version 12.0 the default is 64-bit. But there is a startup flag that allows you to change the default. Because we had a customer last week, in fact, who they wanted to interoperate with really old pre-version 10.1 and
The one to the right, is this a tie number or what?
the first one is a tie number, and the second one is the size. It's slightly confusing. It's just so that the tie number for the 64-bit file is 64 and the 32-bit file is 1. Oh, 1. Ah. Well, so much for that. Yeah.
It's another file. It's 32-bit.
It's another file I opened on the previous slide. It happened to be a 32-bit file. Yeah. Yeah, I've already said that. Also, yes, if you set journaling on a file, you can't interoperate with previous works. But journaling is also something you can switch on and off.
Well, it would be nice if we could just set some parameter that says the defaults will be such and such, Unicode
Yeah.
64, and we don't actually have to set it after that.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. Okay, so I've said this, so here's our non-Unicode file. I can write APL characters to it because they're in quad AV. I now switch Unicode off on my 64-bit file just to show I can do it, and then try and write these Chinese characters to it, and I get a translation error. Right? I try and set Unicode bit to 1 on the 32-bit file, get a translation error. It's not allowed at the moment. And I've said that a couple of times. Right. So on our web page, if you go to dialog.com/help, in fact, all of the online help for version 12 is there converted into HTML. And this is just to show there's an interoperability and compatibility page there, which has tables of what versions can if you create something with one version, can you read it with another, and so on. I won't go into that. Okay, do I really want to attempt this demo? I think not. I'll skip this one. This is a very complicated demo where I start 3 versions of APL and I create files and I turn the flags on and off and show you those errors.
We believe
Just
you.
take my word for it. I'm happy to skip over that one. Okay, so TCP Sockets objects now have an encoding property which has 2 purposes. One is for APL style sockets. You can, well, the default is classic because our worry here was somebody would get a version 12 system, put it live on their server, and then there'd still be a client out there in the network that was running version 11.
Right.
And it would receive a Unicode array and it would just fall flat on its face. So the default is classic. Again, you should make sure you've got all the versions upgraded and then explicitly set that when you're ready to go to Unicode. And for character style sockets, you can set it to UTF8, which means that any data you send out on a text mode socket gets translated. So if you're running a web server written in APL, then you can just set that and everything gets converted as it goes in and out. Yeah. Congo, which is our new tool for TCP communications, is really only available for version 12, so it doesn't have those issues. It always sends the data in internal form and you get the translation error. If the system doesn't crash, you just get that error. Okay, external variables. How many people are using external variables? Okay, think about moving on. External variables, they're files that are essentially mapped into a variable in the workspace, and internally they're represented as 32-bit component files. And they're really, we feel at this point, more trouble than they're worth. They put serious constraints on what we can do to optimize our parser and stuff like that, and we would really like to see them go. So you can't do this. You cannot put any Unicode data into an external variable. We could do that work. I mean, if somebody twists our arms sufficiently hard, we could do it, but we really, external variables are one of those things we would really like to move on from. We think object orientation provides other ways to achieve similar functionality, and mapped files. Okay, mapped files we cannot, although they're perfectly well supported in version 12. The use of APL mapped files, which again are like external variables where there's APL header information in there is something that we also would like to get rid of. But support for raw mapped files where you've got some text out there and you map it is something that we think is going to get more important. The problem here is that so you can map, if you've got a text file out there, you can map it with type 80, which is one of the new Unicode formats, and you can manipulate it. But we cannot provide support for type 82 in the Unicode edition, because when a mapped file is used in the workspace, it's just a piece of memory in the workspace, and to translate that on every access to it would complicate the interpreter too much. So here, if you're using mapped files, if you're using mapped files that a C application or some other form of application wrote, then probably you just need to change the 82 to an 80, and all of the data that we want to read will be what you expect it to be. In fact, some of the errors that you used to have for characters which were being mapped to APL symbols will go away. But of course, if your code was taking steps to deal with those errors, then you may need to delete some code. You need to look at it, but it shouldn't be a big deal. Oh yes, and of course you can map it as type 83, as 1-byte integers, and then do your own mapping by indexing it to whatever you. Okay. If you've written your own DLLs or auxiliary processors, there is no change to the format except that you may get new data types in the arrays that get passed to your library. And we have upgraded our libraries, but if you've written your own APs that deal with text rather than just dealing with numbers, you need to somehow upgrade those to recognize the new data types and deal with them accordingly. You don't have to do anything about the results that you return. On the other hand, you can return Unicode or non-Unicode data, and we'll handle it when it comes in to the system. As I say this, I'm very slightly in doubt as to whether we actually did put some code in here to translate data going out. I don't think we did. Yeah, native files. The Unicode edition still supports the type number 82 when reading and writing native files. Same way that Quad DR supports it. So if you've written something in version 11 here, you can read it again with type 82 and you'll get the characters you expected, the symbols you expected, because the data type will be different. So again, if the next thing you do is take that data and use dyadic Quad DR to cast it into a float or a 4-byte integer, you will not get the same results. So again, it depends on what you were doing with that data, whether you need to do anything about it. Yeah, you need to have a look at your using native files. Right, and one change, when you append to a native file, in version before 12 there was only one type of character data, so you didn't need to declare which type you wanted to append. You just said quad n append without a type and it knew it was character and wrote it out. For a while in the beta program in version 12, we took the same approach with characters as with integers, that they just go out with whatever type, internal type they have. But that didn't work very well because people would, the one moment they would append something which was all in ANSI and it would go out with 1 byte per character, and the next thing they do, there'd be an APL character, it would go out 2 bytes per character. And we decided the safe thing to do was to force type 80 as the default. and give a domain error if you wrote something that couldn't go out as 80, and force you then to declare the type. So if you need to store APL text, if you need to store APL functions, say, in a native file, you have essentially, well, two obvious choices. Write them out as type 160, which means the file is then in UCS2 format, 2 bytes per UCS2 encoded. But these days, the logical thing to do would be to use UTF8, which means that then a very wide variety of applications would be able to deal with it. So what you need to do then is use dyadic
So you have to do
yeah.
you have to do it explicitly?
Yeah, you have to explicitly, we debated for a long time whether we should have a data type number that's made UTF8, UTF16 and so on. At the end of the day, we decided that, at least to begin with, since we had provided a feature to do that, we wouldn't provide two features to do that. Yeah, maybe we should have done differently. It's not difficult to write UTF-8 text to a native file. One of the arguments against supporting UTF-8 was that when you were reading it, it's a variable length format. So what does the argument about the position mean? And what happens if you ask it to start reading in the middle of the UTF-8 sequence? And so for that reason we decided, well, we're going to duck that one. You can use .ucs. And if you write it out and then you use .cmd then you can open Notepad on it. Oh yes, one point, the monadic .ucs here. Right, so the dyadic .ucs returns numbers between 0 and 255. If you just write those to a native file, the ones above 127 actually need to be doubled. They're 2-byte integers, and that screws up the format. So using quad UCS here, it turns them back into type 80 characters, bytes per number, and you then write them out. So you'll often see that when using UTF-8, examples will have one quad UCS to turn it into integers, and then another one to turn it into text. Yeah. Let's see. I think I've said most of this. Okay. What's interesting here is how do you determine this last point here? How do you determine when you get a native file what format the data is in? Somebody says, well, here's a Unicode. Here's some Unicode data, and they send you a file. There's a thing called a byte order mark. It's a convention which is used. It's more widely used under Windows than under Unix, but it's quite widely used, and it's worth knowing about. There's a Unicode character. Its name is 0 with no break space, and it's FEFF. And the reason, I guess they chose that bit pattern because it made it easy to, if you look at the first few bytes of the file, if it begins with this sequence, that's the UTF-8 encoding of that byte order mark. If it's FFFE, it's UTF-16 or UCS2 written by a little endian machine, and so on and so forth. So many applications like Notepad will look at that, and if it's there, they'll detect it. There are also applications which will then scan the rest of the file and see, does it conform to, would it be valid UTF-8, and then read it. But unfortunately, there's no clear standard for this.
How do you distinguish between the second and fourth?
I suppose you have to read 4 bytes.
But what if somebody is writing the UCS2
and begin with a null?
and then yeah.
Well, it's not. It's not infallible. You can only use it to guess. I suppose it's considered very bad form to write a UTF-16 file which begins with 00. Yeah. I mean, well, if you're a C programmer, then 0 usually means, well, that's the end of the data.
Yeah.
So it's unlikely. Yeah. Okay, yeah. The order of bullets
Guess is
coming
the
up
right word.
Guess is the only word you can use for this. And sometimes, if you write the byte order mark, it might make, the receiving application crash because it wasn't expecting it. It just, all of its other data sources just made UTF-8 without a byte order mark. And by putting in the byte order mark, you make the thing fall over. So this is for your information. It helps you to guess. There's no rule about this. So here's some code we'll take a break in a moment. Here's a piece of code to read a file. Ties the file, reads the first 3 bytes. If the signature is this, we think it's that. Read it in and do the quad UCS thing. Otherwise, if it's -1, -2, it's a Berendian. Otherwise, we think it's ANSI. We just read it and type it. So you might want to write code like that, depending on your environment. Absolutely. Moving on. And there's, again, just to show this, the online help again, there's reading and writing Unicode text files as a section there, and there's code example.
Presumably that earlier one also returns the format, so I can do a file copy by... No, it doesn't. Okay.
No, it doesn't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I'm just trying to wrap this UTF-8 thing up. So if you wanted to write a UTF-8 web page, so you've got some APL data you want to write to a web page. There it is. It's the definition of a little defun called plus. It's defined as such. You want to put that out there on a web page, which if you clicked on it with Internet Explorer or Firefox, they would see that function. Then the first thing you do is you put it inside font face equals APL385 Unicode /font. That's not necessary for Firefox, but Internet Explorer has strange ideas about fonts and screws it up if you don't. And then there's the rest is that in the header section of your HTML, you put this incantation which says content type text HTML character set equals UTF-8. And then you write append it to the create file called HTM, write it out as UTF-8, and now a web page will be able to read that and display it like so. There we go. So there's what it displays like in Internet Explorer, and here's the view source of the web page. So it's a bit cleaner than what you can see in the APL code. So it's quite easy now to create a web page or a text file that any